What so often happens is we send them to school, creativity gets halted. They sort of learn that conformity is valued over creativity and obedience is valued over originality. All of that kind of natural exuberance for learning and discovery that young children have can often get eroded when they enter into a formal classroom environment.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Kerry McDonald, author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. Kerry is a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. In this episode, we talk about the massive growth of homeschooling and unschooling after the COVID-19 pandemic, how to find the right learning community for you and your children, and how to support your child's unique interests. We also talk about basic questions like how to get started with homeschooling, what to do if your child wants to learn something that you don't know how to teach, and socialization, everyone's first question about homeschooling. Now, here is Kerry. I'll start with the most obvious question, which is, I think a lot of people do not know what the word unschooling means. So what is unschooling?
Yeah, so in the book, I define unschooling as disentangling education from schooling and looking at, schooling as one method to be educated, certainly the most dominant in our society, but it's really not the only one. And in fact, in terms of compulsory schooling, which I detail a lot of the history of in the book, mass schooling is a relatively recent kind of cultural phenomenon dating back to the mid-19th century. And prior to that, there was a much broader, more, sort of varied definition of education. One of my favorite quotes, in fact, from the book is from the education historian Carl Castle, who wrote the book Pillars of the Republic. And he says, society educates in many ways, the state educates through schools. And so I wanted to write the book to really draw attention to the idea that one could learn and be educated without conventional schooling, including what we would think of as maybe traditional forms of homeschooling, which are these school-at-home methods that essentially just change the location of schooling from a classroom to a home. And I think that's what a lot of families discovered over the past year, certainly last spring with the school closures as a result of the coronavirus, that they were simply, changing the setting of schooling, but for all intents and purposes, it remained the same. And unschooling sort of challenges, families and educators to maybe look a little bit more broadly at education and think about it beyond the four walls of a classroom or even of a, kitchen table.
You got to three different questions I was going to ask you in one. So I was also curious about...
Well, we can delve into each of those.
Because I think that's a question a lot of people have when they first start thinking about homeschooling, is they mentally try to replicate the school experience outside of school rather than questioning, is the school experience really an experience that you should replicate or is worth replicating? So I guess we'll step back for a bit. When it comes to education and unschooling, what is it that you are trying to do? And how is that different than the, I guess, goals or mindset of traditional compulsory? I guess I shouldn't call it traditional because it's not. You're right. It's very recent. But compulsory government schooling. What does unschooling look like or trying to be that's different from that?
Yeah, so my motivation for writing Unschooled was really to profile the families that were learning this way, sort of self-directed education tied to a child's interests and passions, facilitated by parents, and really involving, a full immersion in one's community and the people, places, and things around them, so that parents would really be the ones connecting their children and their children's interests to available community resources and mentors and tutoring and classes and activities, so that it's really a whole community kind of education experience, and in many ways much more authentic than sort of the age-segregated classrooms with a standardized curriculum that you'd find in a conventional school environment. And in fact, a lot of the reason why, for the growth in homeschooling pre-pandemic, and of course we can talk about just the explosive growth in independent homeschooling over the past year, but even prior to that, the New York Times, for example, had an article several years ago detailing this kind of surge in homeschooling, in particular among urban secular families who were really disillusioned by Common Core curriculum frameworks and the kind of increased testing and standardization in classrooms, and wanted something different, wanted a much more sort of bespoke, customized education experience for their children that, in many ways, I think prepares kids for the innovation era, and kind of the realities of the 21st century much more effectively than kind of our industrial model of education that's, again, entrenched in kind of the 19th century model that we still have today.
One of the things I do really want to ask about is how post-COVID homeschooling has changed, because I think that woke a lot of people up to the fact that school is not meeting children's needs or helpful or even the safe choice anymore. So I'm curious because I've talked to people who have done homeschooling for a while, and the questions were always sort of the same of like, well, how do you do it? And what's your curriculum? And I wonder if those questions have changed post-COVID. So I'm curious what you've noticed before that, the things that people were curious about, and what you're noticing now. How has COVID changed
Yeah,
the questions around homeschooling or unschooling?
dramatically so. Yeah, dramatically so. I mean, this has been a year of education transformation. I don't think we're ever going to go back to kind of education as usual. I think that's a good thing. For the most part, parents have been re-empowered. They've been put back in charge of their children's education in ways that were unimaginable pre-pandemic. Beginning last spring, these parents, all of a sudden, through much disruption and a great bit of challenge, were able to see up close what their kids were actually learning in school or not learning in school through the pandemic-related Zoom schooling that many districts and independent schools launched, and that continued over the past year. And I think for a lot of parents, it was a real wake-up call that maybe, this isn't the best educational environment for their kids. For example, I have a neighbor who decided to homeschool this spring. And she was the wheels started turning last spring as a result of the school closures, where she discovered that her child's teacher was reading a book to the class that her child herself had read a couple of years prior. So just even that kind of more intimate look at what was happening in the classroom, I think was a real wake-up call for a lot of families, and they were able to kind of start to think about education beyond their assigned district school. I think the other thing was that parents were maybe thinking about homeschooling in the past, but sort of lacked that catalyst to make it happen. Maybe they were never really satisfied with their child's schooling, but they, didn't sort of have a trigger to exit until the pandemic enabled that to happen through the school closures. And they said, "Oh, now is my opportunity." And so I think a lot of parents seized that moment to pull their kids out of school. And also, I think parents really became frustrated even throughout the 2020-2021 academic year as school closures continued in many places. And parents just said, this remote schooling is not working for my kids. I need something better for them. And so they continually pulled their kids out throughout this current or just ending academic year, to the point that the U.S. Census Bureau came out with data in February showing that that more than 11% of U.S. K-12 students are currently being homeschooled this academic year. Wow. And that's a more than tripling of pre-pandemic homeschooling levels based on other federal data from the U.S. Department of Education, suggesting that about 3.5% of the U.S. K-12 school-age population had been homeschooling. So we went from under 2 million homeschoolers pre-pandemic to now more than 5.5 million homeschoolers this academic year. Most of the growth, interestingly, according to the US Census Bureau, was coming from families of color, in particular Black families that saw a five-fold increase in homeschooling rates from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020. Just dramatic increase. In fact, now an overrepresentation of Black homeschoolers in the homeschooling population compared to in the K to 12 public school population. There's now more than as I said, 16% of today's homeschoolers are Black homeschoolers compared to 15% of Black students in the overall K to 12 public school population. So just tremendous growth. And I think parents really realizing that they can do better. They don't have to be the ones doing all of the teaching. This sort of gets back to your earlier question about sort of the difference between homeschooling and unschooling, or what is unschooling. And it really challenges this idea that, you have to be sitting around the kitchen table, going through a bunch of textbooks or a prepackaged curriculum, kind of our stereotypical view of homeschooling. With unschooling, and in particular now, so many of the technological resources available to families choosing a different learning path, a parent's role really is much more about connecting and facilitating learning than it is about doing the active instruction. And so I think a lot of families realized that this was more feasible for them than they otherwise might have thought.
I like that frame of that you're facilitating it. And I guess it goes back to the question of like, how is it that children actually learn? Because I think very often when people have a question about homeschooling, there's like implied in there the idea that you're schooling, and all of the assumptions that people have around schooling come up, as opposed to, what do kids actually need and how do they learn? Because I know as an adult, when I want to learn something, I don't always sit in a room with someone talking at me for 45 minutes straight. I do a whole bunch of different things. So how is it that children actually learn, and how is it that you as a parent, especially with so many people who are new to this, how is it that you facilitate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good question. And one of the things I touch on in the book, Unschooled, which I should mention came out in the spring of 2019, but actually had far more interest, a renewed interest throughout 2020, in the spring of 2020, as schools shut down and parents suddenly were looking for resources of how to do this, how to live and learn alongside children at home. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that, it used to be that parents would send their kids to school because that was where the books were, that was where the knowledge was, that was where the teachers were. And of course, for us now in the 21st century, all of that is around us. And I think, and I make the point that you've made as well, is look at how we as adults learn, how we continue to, pursue knowledge or discover new skills and interests. It's very often through community networks and technology. And we are able to sort of pick and choose our instructors and pick and choose our classes, and find mentors and members of our community to help us. And so a lot of it is just extending that same freedom to learn to our children. And I think, again, another real breakthrough from the coronavirus pandemic, as devastating as it's been for so many families, is it's encouraged more families that and more employers to embrace working from home. And in fact, the Brookings Institution came out with a research paper just finding that, working from home is here to stay, that many companies are going to continue to embrace either hybrid work schedules or remote only work schedules. And so I think as parents discover that they may have more flexibility than ever before in their work, that they're not tied to sort of a 9 to 5 schedule in an office building 5 days a week, that they'll want to extend that same flexibility in learning to their kids.
It's interesting how many of the institutions we have were designed for cultural things, or designed for systems that are no longer relevant. So back when I was in high school, I read John Taylor Gatto's Underground History of American Education, where he talks about some of the things that you do about how schooling was basically designed to create workers for the industrial system. And of course, that system no longer exists. And if you even if you were just trying to train workers, it's not what you're training them for anymore. But the challenge is that, of course, when you do that, there's cultural ideas that are created. So I'm curious what misconceptions people who were brought up in the school system have that they might need to let go of or dispel if they want something different for their children? Because, anytime you're trying to give people a new idea, you always have to address the misconceptions. So what are the misconceptions that people have going into homeschooling or thinking about this, if they've come from the school system and gone through that and maybe picked up whatever cultural programming it instilled in them?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, that's where this past year has been such a boon for homeschooling is that it's now sort of a really mainstream option. It had certainly been moving over the past several decades from kind of the margins to the mainstream of education, and more and more families were choosing it. But nothing like this past year. And so I think just a result of the fact that you now have sort of comparable numbers of students homeschooling as attending K-12 private schools in the U.S., shows that it's really a legitimate option for families. And I think that will help to eliminate any of sort of the remaining stereotypes that might have lingered from the early days of homeschooling before it was even really legally recognized, which didn't happen until the mid 1990s. And so, yeah, I think more families are discovering that this is, a great path for them. And I think that they're realizing that there are just so many resources available to them, that this is not an isolated practice, that this is not something that, that again, requires a parent staying home full time, or typically a mom, again, being the one to teach from a curriculum and be solely responsible for a child's education. They realize there's just so many other resources available to them. And I will say, one encouraging statistic has come out of EdChoice, and they've been tracking since April of 2020 parents' responses in a variety of surveys to school closures and education disruption since the beginning of the pandemic last March. So their first survey came out in April, and they found in that survey that more than half of the parents surveyed had a more favorable view of homeschooling than they did prior to the school closures. And I remember thinking at the time, gosh, if parents think that this version of pandemic kind of crisis homeschooling is good, or they have a favorable opinion of it, just imagine the real thing. We were all, and homeschoolers included, completely severed from our communities. We weren't able to go to the library or the museums or get together with friends or attend classes in person. So it was a shock for everyone. And yet the fact that more than half of parents thought more favorably of homeschooling, even under those extreme circumstances, I thought was a good indicator that we were going to see some significant growth in independent homeschooling over the course of the year. And we did. I mentioned the U.S. Census Bureau data. Gallup and Education Week also did other polls of families and found similar numbers of parents choosing homeschooling over this previous academic year. So just tremendous growth. And then EdChoice continued to survey parents every month from April 2020 up until the present. And back in February of 2021, they discovered that 64% of parents had a more favorable view of homeschooling than they did prior to the pandemic. So it was actually increasing as homeschooling went along, or as school closures continued. And again, this is still a case where in many places, including I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, our museums have just started to reopen recently. Our libraries still closed for in-person browsing. So still to see parents have a more favorable view of homeschooling in light of those circumstances, I think is a positive sign that many parents will stick with it even into the next academic year and beyond.
So crisis homeschooling is better than school as normal.
It was shocking to see that. Yeah, and that was really my first indicator that something big was going to happen over the course of this academic year, that there was really going to be some substantial change. Another big signal was the first week of July of 2020 was the first week that parents in the state of North Carolina were able to submit their intent to homeschool form online. And so many parents went on to the website that first week of July that it crashed the state's education website. And they just experienced significant growth in homeschooling numbers this year, and other states did as well. So, just dramatic change. And then as a result of that, we've seen really big declines in public school enrollment in most states across the country, down an average of about 2% in public school enrollment this year, based just on school closures or the pandemic response, not on any demographic changes. Some states like Arizona down 5%, Massachusetts down 4% in public school enrollment, and seeing increases in homeschooling and charter schools and some private schools as well in many areas, as in particular private schools were able to stay open or reopen in ways that district schools were not.
So my wife and I are having our first child in August, and homeschooling.
Oh,
Thank
congratulations.
you. Homeschooling's always been an intention, or unschooling in some form, but obviously we're new to this. And I suspect many of the other people that you're talking about who are listening to this are also new to this. So if we are new to this and it's our intention, where's the best place to start? And again, like for us, we have, at least 2 years while they're very small that we don't have to be thinking about it, but it's good to start planning now. So where would we begin?
Well, maybe I'll start by sharing a little bit of my journey
Sure.
and then kind of how I came to choose homeschooling for my kids or unschooling for my kids. So, when I was an undergraduate, I was an economics major in the late 1990s, but was increasingly interested in education policy, particularly from an economics lens, and in particular, the lack of choices that a lot of families had in terms of education. And for my senior year, I was able to do a research project on an education topic of my choice for an education class I was taking. And I decided to explore the idea of homeschooling. And I went to K to 12 public schools. I never knew a homeschooler. This again was the late 1990s. As I mentioned earlier, homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all US states a few years prior. So it was still a relatively new phenomenon. In fact, the US Department of Education only began tracking homeschoolers in 1999, counting 850,000 at the time. So it was still really very much in the margins. And not at all the kind of mainstream option that it's become. But I was so curious about this other way of learning outside of conventional schooling. And I had a classmate who had a family member who lived nearby who was homeschooling and invited me to shadow them for the semester to see, what homeschooling was like. What is it like to learn outside of a conventional classroom? And I remember walking into that family's home and just being completely captivated by what I saw. The child was 8 years old at the time, and she was just so curious and creative and at ease with adults and confident. Interestingly, my first question to the mom was, well, what about socialization? Which I sort of cringe at now that I asked that question, but of course it is sort of the gut,
It's the first
the gut
question
question.
everyone who homeschools gets.
But it was very quickly, it very quickly became apparent to me that this child was authentically socialized. She was being social in her community, taking advantage of all of these community networks and classes and extracurricular programs and interacting with people of all different ages and all different ways in a really authentic way. And what was most striking to me was that same semester I was also doing a student teaching practicum at a local public elementary school, which I hadn't really thought much about until I started to see this homeschool child, and the ages were about the same, second grade. And I, for the first time, was really able to see this stark contrast between this traditional, conventional style of schooling, age segregated classrooms, a standardized curriculum, a real focus on order and compliance and obedience, and what we would think of as socialization in that way, and this genuine socialization that this homeschool child was having by just being fully immersed in the people, places, and things around her. And I think that was really the image that stuck with me and certainly remained with me. After college, I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard and continued to be interested in education options, education choice, homeschooling always being in the back of my mind. And then when, sort of a decade later, I was looking at education options for my own children, I could have remembered those images of, what is the kind of social environment I want for my child? What is the kind of learning environment I want for, at that time, my oldest daughter? And I realized that, if I had sent her to school, her learning really would have contracted. She would go from really this kind of robust immersion in our community and going to the library and museums and interacting with friends and people of all different ages and stages to being in an age-segregated classroom with the same peer group of students and the same kind of static handful of teachers, the same building every day. And to me, that just seemed like I would be, or my husband and I would be, limiting her education as opposed to expanding it. And so that's what ultimately, led us to decide to homeschool. And then I'll sort of, I'm sort of long-winded response, but I'll sort of end with in the early years, kind of her preschool years, she was learning in a very self-directed way, following her interests and really, being very curious and us being able to connect her interests with various resources. And then I remember as my daughter reached kindergarten age and I said, really we have to start getting serious about her, formal learning, so I started researching various curriculum that would teach her the 3 R's, make sure, that she learned how to read and do basic numeracy and all of this. And as I was sort of thinking about, spending thousands of dollars on curriculum or finding the one that would be the best fit, out of nowhere, she taught herself how to read. And I thought, maybe I'll hold off on this curriculum right now and just see, what else we can do. She was still little. Let's just see how kindergarten goes. And sure enough, as you'll discover, and I'm sure you've seen in other aspects of your life, kids are incredibly curious when they're young, and they're always asking questions, and they're always eager to learn new things and to know new things. And if all we need to do as parents is to cultivate that creativity and that curiosity. But what so often happens is we send them to school and that creativity gets halted. They sort of learn that conformity is valued over creativity and obedience is valued over originality. And so all of that kind of natural exuberance for learning and discovery that young children have can often get eroded when they enter into a formal classroom environment.
I know as someone who works in a collaborative field in the arts, I definitely had to unlearn certain emotional lessons taught during high school group projects. That there's just, because when people talk about socialization and children needing to go to school to learn, they don't realize they're also learning emotional lessons and lessons about how they relate to other people. And so you mentioned the socialization question, which is something that I think everyone who considers homeschooling or unschooling gets asked about. What is the way to allow your children to get the socialization that is best for them or that will serve them the most? Because one of the things that, having a kid is making me think about is like, okay, what group of people am I socializing them into? Like, what group of people do I want around my kids who they're going to be unconsciously picking up habits from? I look at the images now post-COVID of kids being put in these like sort of weird plastic bubbles or having police officers stand over them to make sure they're wearing their mask at school. And I think I probably don't want them socialized into that. But what instead of that do I want, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good point. And I think, again, parents taking a look at what was happening in their children's schools, and then certainly the back to school guidelines with social distancing and all day mask wearing and these plastic barricades. I think a lot of parents said, that's not really a great learning environment. I think we can do something better, at least temporarily. And then many of them discovered, hey, this is actually much more rewarding and feasible than I originally thought. Let's continue. But the socialization question is important, and I think it's really just great to know that there are so many homeschooling resources in really every area. So this kind of gets back, I think, to your earlier question of what are the sort of the first steps. And I would say, early on, connect with local homeschooling communities. My oldest daughter was, I think, 2 years old when I first connected with our local homeschool community. We still have friends that we met that year, when we first started going to homeschool park days or outings with other homeschooling families. And now there are just so many more homeschoolers. And then even within, because the homeschooling rate has increased so much and there's so many more homeschoolers, I think you're able to find your, like-minded cohort more easily, and you're able to join various Facebook groups in your local area or listservs or other kind of social networks and figure out, kind of who do you mesh with and what are the learning opportunities available to you and your children. And there's a whole assortment. So in my Unschooled book, I profile a lot of the self-directed learning centers and the I call them unschooling schools, but democratic schools like the Sudbury Valley model of schooling that really focuses on self-directed education. And these programs are really sprouting in all kinds of areas, mostly concentrated in urban areas, but really all over the country. And then there's also, if you don't want sort of the unschooling model, if you want something that's a little more traditional, but still, not kind of a typical schooling environment for your kids. There's classical model of education, and there's often kind of what are known as hybrid classical schools for families that involve, going to a kind of a brick and mortar center for a couple of days a week and then being able to be home I think another few days a week. In fact, Ed Choice's Mike McShane just wrote a great book about hybrid homeschooling and how it's the future, what he thinks is the future of education. So I think we'll see more of those models as well and provide more options for families to find the right educational fit and philosophy for them and their child.
One of the models I've heard about is I've heard it referred to as like pod homeschooling, where a group of families get together and hire a teacher, which made a lot of sense to me because, like, that's, as an adult, one of the ways that I learn is I go to a conference or a talk or a workshop or something for the thing I want to learn about. It almost sounds like the part of the challenge of unschooling is that you have to start consciously thinking about, okay, what do we actually want, as opposed to just defaulting to whatever the dominant culture is suggesting that you have to do. So how is it that you navigate those choices and then also find all the different options? Because it sounds like, there's groups online, there's social media, there's things like that. But I'm not always sure like how to find all of them or which ones are the best, or like, how is it that you do go and try each one out? Do you research online? Like, what's the process of of both finding all the options and then evaluating them and deciding which one might be best?
Right. It's such a good question. Let's start with your point about pods. So these pandemic pods or learning pods really came on the scene last July, in July of 2020, as a lot of families were saying, gosh, at that point, their kids hadn't seen other kids in a few months. They were getting increasingly concerned about what the fall would look like in terms of back to school plans. And so they really started as just organic Facebook groups that were started by parents in various geographic areas, saying, hey, it looks like the next school year is going to be challenging. How about we get together, with a group of families kind of in a small, safe way to provide some of the social interaction for our kids. And so for a lot of families, they use the pod as a way to make homeschooling more realistic, particularly if parents were still working or working from home. This way they were able to gather with other families and either take turns as parents to facilitate a curriculum or supervise the kids, or pool their resources to hire an educator or a college student or tutors to do that for them. And a lot of families also realized that their districts were going to be remote only for at least the fall semester, in many cases for the entire year. And they said, well, we want our kids to have some interaction with other kids. We don't want them to have a repeat of what they had in the spring where they were just alone in their homes doing Zoom school. So they got together in these pod groups so that the kids could do district Zoom schooling, but together in a small, safe space, but again, tied to their district. In that case, they, of course, weren't pulling their kids from school for independent homeschooling. They were just doing Zoom school in a small group. And there's been tremendous growth with pandemic pods. Of course, there's sort of this modern twist on time-honored homeschool co-ops that have been around since the beginning of the modern homeschooling movement in the 1970s, but really I think have taken off. Another thing that the pods were really able to do is bring to light the microschool movement that was accelerating prior to the pandemic and continues to take off. This would be these microschool networks, similar to what I mentioned about hybrid homeschool models, where you often have these in-home programs with multi-age students. There's a hired teacher or a parent who's trained as a guide who is able to facilitate a curriculum. Often there's proprietary software associated with it that will help to facilitate, in many cases, self-directed education. A lot of the microschools are really focused on kind of these unschooling principles. So we have all of these options, I think, for families. And you're right, sometimes it can be overwhelming. Where do you begin, or how do you find the one that fits you for you? And as much as social media can be a pain sometimes, I think it can be helpful in this instance for connecting families to available homeschooling resources. I mean, for example, when we started homeschooling, Yahoo Groups was sort of the place that everybody went, and that's how we were able to connect with homeschoolers. And those Yahoo Groups has sort of gone by the wayside now, and really it's Facebook groups
I love that
where
we're
you're able
both
to
old enough
connect.
to get that reference. Thank you.
I
I got
know.
taken back in time for a moment.
I know. So I think it's just where it is. I'm sure there'll be, something else in another few years, but often just, searching for your location, either your city or state, and homeschooling, you'll find resources there. You may find links to grassroots homeschooling organizations or state advocacy groups for homeschoolers in your area that can help link you to some of these social networks or Facebook groups. And the thing that is good about these social media groups is you're often able to wade through a bunch of different groups and see what's being offered. You can look at kind of a broad geographic area. So sometimes, maybe in your immediate area, there's not a good fit, but if you kind of expand your search to Facebook groups that are outside of your kind of local neighborhoods, you might find, other activities or groups that are more suitable for you. You can find, unschooling groups. You can find classical education groups. You can find Montessori homeschoolers or Waldorf homeschoolers, or all kinds of different educational approaches, and hopefully pick and choose from there.
Someone's going to build an app around this that's location based. That's going to completely change this. I see the opportunity there because you're right. You're right. There's just so many different options, and there's such an important demand for them. One thing I wanted to ask is unschooling around topics that are not academic. So this is one of the things that I was thinking about when looking at your book and the concept of unschooling, which was that a lot of the things that I, as an adult, have got the most benefit from learning were not academic in any way. So things like music or art, people talk about like PE and physical education being removed from schools, and the fact that people aren't exercising as much, and like that's obvious. So I'm curious how you would approach also adding those non-academic things into your unschooling. Is there a way to do that as well?
Well, the good news is that homeschoolers typically have kind of more of this cultural immersion into their communities than children who go to school. In fact, University of Oklahoma education professor Daniel Hamlin has done research on what he calls cultural capital, and he finds that homeschooling families are twice as likely to go to a library, a cultural event, a concert, a historic site, a bookstore, a museum, a zoo than school children are. So I think some of it is just that, we sort of look at the world as our classroom as homeschoolers, and we're eager to take advantage of all of those amazing resources. And many of these places cater to homeschoolers. They have special homeschool days or special homeschool, weekly classes. They'll have special programming for homeschoolers. And so, it's a great way of really connecting with all of these wonderful resources instead of just a field trip once a year that a schooled kid might go on. So there's that. And I think part of it is also just realizing, not only what you as a family are interested in or the parents are interested in, exposing kids to that, but also really being on the lookout for what our children are really passionate about and helping to connect them to resources. And one of the examples I use in the book is my daughter was really interested in taking martial arts classes. A new martial arts studio had opened up near our home, and she thought it was intriguing and went for a trial class and fell in love with it. And so she started taking martial arts classes. And then from there, she became really interested in Korean language and culture. And so at first I connected her with online language software Duolingo, which you may know of. It's a free online language learning software. And so she started doing Korean language instruction there, but wanted something more rigorous. And so I was able to find an in-person tutor for her. This was pre-pandemic. It's been over Zoom for the past year. But someone in our city who was a native of South Korea and fluent in Korean. And they've been meeting several times a week now for about 3 years, doing, one-on-one Korean language, instruction. And I love this example because I think it's sort of it sort of captures what unschooling really is. It's allowing a child's interests to drive their learning and shows, the parent's role of sort of connecting the child with resources, and if one resource isn't enough, to figure out what else might be available for them. And then also gets to the idea that, sometimes parents will say, well, I don't know calculus. How could I ever teach my kids calculus? And I said, well, I don't know Korean, but this is how it works. And I think it's another, just sort of good example of leveraging the resources around us, many of which are free or low cost, to facilitate our child's education.
How is it that you discover your child's interests or expose them to things that will allow them to figure out what they like? So you mentioned that your daughter passed a martial arts studio and got curious about it, and then that led to an interest in Korean. How is it that you sort of notice that and then also give them the opportunity to have that initial spark?
I think it's a lot like how we as adults learn and discover new things too. It comes from being exposed to different experiences, engaging with other people in our community, friends and neighbors and other community members, to see what's possible and what you're interested in. My older son is a big skateboarder, and so it became very clear early on that was a passion of his. And then we were able to connect with other, skateboarders in our local area. And now he has a wonderful group. Actually, many of them homeschool. In fact, many of them decided to pull their kids out during the pandemic and are not planning on going back now that they've discovered kind of this great skateboarding homeschooling community there. So, I think some of it's watching what your kids naturally like, and the other part of it is just exposing them to as many varied experiences and opportunities as possible.
I love that image of a skateboarding homeschooling group, because when I was growing up, there was a stereotype of homeschoolers being like highly religious Christian kids, because those were the families that were very vocal about it and also willing to put in the effort to figure it out. And so I'm curious now if there is a different image of unschooling or homeschooling than maybe people are familiar with or has been projected out into the culture before.
Yeah, I think this is one of those lingering stereotypes that for some reason doesn't seem to go away despite evidence to the contrary. I mean, the history of the modern homeschooling movement shows that homeschooling began on the liberal left. It was hippie communes in the late 1960s and early 1970s of kind of this anti-establishment families that didn't want to send their kids to school and were raising and educating them themselves. So it started there, and then it grew through the religious right, through conservatives on the right that helped with expanding its numbers and helping it to become legally recognized. But now it's a really sort of bipartisan movement and encompasses all kinds of families for a variety of different reasons. In fact, according to the most recent U.S. Department of Education data from 2016, only 12% of families said that they were choosing homeschooling for religious purposes. So the number one motivator for homeschooling families today is concern about the environment of other schools, including safety, drugs, and negative peer pressure. Again, that's according to U.S. Department of Education data. So it's just simply not true that families are choosing homeschooling for religious purposes. There may be religious families who choose to homeschool, but even there, the data show that it's sort of representative of U.S. society as a whole. About 2/3, for example, about 2/3, this is according to The Atlantic, 2/3 of Americans identify as Christian, for example, and about 2/3 of homeschoolers also identify as Christian, but they're not necessarily homeschooling for those reasons. It's just part of what they would indicate as part of their identity. But really, homeschooling is much more reflective today of American society more broadly, both socioeconomically, demographically, geographically, really in every way.
One thing I noticed, you know a lot of data about homeschooling, and I'm curious if there's any data about the outcomes of homeschoolers or unschoolers versus people who go through the traditional system. Because I know a lot of people from my generation who consider themselves burnout gifted kids who got the degree, who did what they were supposed to, and it didn't work out the way that they hoped it would. And at the same time, people have this idea, oh, these homeschool kids, like, where are they going to be without socialization? And all the people I knew who went that route turned out pretty fine. So I'm curious, is there data that shows the difference in outcome between homeschool and public education?
There is. Yeah, there is. The most recent and some of the most robust data is a literature review by Lindsay Burke at the Heritage Foundation, where she found that there are positive outcomes for homeschooled kids compared to their schooled peers. She says a lot of that could be due to parental involvement in education, which we know is a factor of education success, regardless of where a child is educated, whether it's in a conventional school or not. But certainly by definition, homeschooling would entail a lot more parental involvement, and that leads to positive outcomes for children, regardless of kind of the homeschooling approach a particular family takes. Now, for unschoolers specifically, Peter Gray wrote the foreword to my unschooled book. He's a psychology professor at Boston College. He wrote the book Free to Learn and is a big advocate of unschooling and self-directed education. He and his colleague Gina Riley did a survey of grown unschoolers and found that they had, great success in adulthood, that they were often, again, given a lot of freedom and flexibility in their learning during their childhood and adolescence. Many of them, if they decided that they were going to head to college, which in this particular sample, most of them did, they took community college classes as adolescents, often in lieu of high school, and were able to accumulate college credits and then transfer those into a four-year university. And they did well in college or university. They didn't have trouble adapting to a university lifestyle. In fact, some of them said their biggest complaint was that their peers weren't as excited about learning as they were, and that they spent more time with their professors and engaging in kind of independent research with their professors because they really retained that love of learning. And my favorite statistic from Dr. Gray's survey of grown unschoolers is that he found that more than half of these grown unschoolers were working as entrepreneurs in fields that were tied to interests that they began to develop in childhood or adolescence through their unschooling. So just being able to retain a lot of that creativity and ingenuity into adulthood.
That is good to hear, and not surprising that people who naturally learn and self-start would become go into a profession where they have to learn and self-start.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And in a wide range of fields, ranging from kind of STEM fields to more creative fields. He found a lot of variety there.
One other question that comes to mind is how to prepare your kids not for the world as it is now, but the world they're going to be in. Because you mentioned homeschoolers and homeschoolers getting into college. And that's a thought I've heard from people before is like, well, if I homeschool, how are my kids going to get into a good college? And I just thought, I don't know where the institution of college is going to be in 20 years or if that will even be that relevant for their success in the world. So I'm also curious how you calibrate for like what world you're preparing them for when the world changes so quickly, and the world, if you prepare them for the world that you grew up in, it might not even be relevant for where they are now.
Yeah, I'll sort of answer it in two parts. The first being, what about college and what are the options there? And the second, sort of this amorphous future that none of us really know. With the former, I just wrote an article recently for fee.org where I'm a senior education fellow about two grown homeschoolers and how they really attribute their unconventional education as children and adolescents to their personal and professional success now as young adults. And one of them said that she took 2 years of community college out in California as a teenager from when she was 15 to 17, and was able to then basically get an associate's degree at the same age that her peer group would be getting a high school diploma. And in California, all of your community college credits automatically transfer to one of the University of California university system. So she ended up going to UCLA and transferring in as a junior. And of course, saving a ton of money because community college is much more affordable, and particularly affordable in a lot of states with dual enrollment that allows homeschoolers or high school students to take community college classes for often half the cost, if not less. So it can be a wonderful way of affording college and creating more of these pathways to adulthood and not sort of waiting around until you're 18 for your life to start, but actually begin to do things sooner. So that's just one thing. I think the kind of community college system for teenagers is really it's sort of this hidden gem, and I hope more families realize it's such a great option, not only for kids who really want to get that head start in academics, but also for alleviating a lot of the cost of college. So that's sort of the college piece. But you're right, what is the future? And the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago came out with a survey saying that the most in-demand jobs and skill sets today didn't exist 5 years ago. So we just have no idea, what the jobs of the future will be. The World Economic Forum in their Future of Jobs report this past fall came up with sort of an update on this, and they said that by 2025, humans and machines will be sharing work equally. So they'll kind of equal tasks for humans and machines. Right now, humans have a little bit of the edge, but that's about to disappear. And again, the idea, and I talk a lot about this in my Unschooled book too, is there's this idea that we still have this 19th century model of conventional schooling focused on obedience and compliance and conformity, and standardization and order. And yet we have this 21st century innovation era where we're increasingly competing with machines for these jobs that we don't even know will exist. And so, when we think about that, how do we prepare our kids for this unknown future? And what I like to say is, we need to capitalize on what makes humans distinct from robots. What is it that separates human intelligence from artificial intelligence? And it's things like creativity, curiosity, ingenuity, and entrepreneurial spirit. These are all of the human differentiators, and these are the things that we should be cultivating, not crushing, in our students and in our children. And that's where I think learning outside of a conventional classroom can be incredibly beneficial for the economic realities of the 21st century.
I think that's a good note to end on. Since we're coming up on an hour now, is there anything that you want to add that we haven't talked about? Anything that you wish I'd asked that I hadn't? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, you can visit me at fee.org/Kerry, so fee.org/KERRY. That's my website. You can see all of my recent articles, links to all my social media accounts. Go ahead and send me an email. You can sign up for my weekly parenting and education newsletter. And that's probably the best way to sort of stay in touch.
Cool. That was going to be my last question, is how to stay in touch. So thank you for sharing that.
Good.
I don't think I have any more questions. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts on unschooling.
Oh, thanks, Brendon, and best wishes for your new arrival later this summer.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the show. I'm actually going to end the episode here because in the second hour, we talk about a communication system I created called language alignment that borrows from critical theory, from neurolinguistic programming, from ideas about how autistic and neurodivergent people think. And I'm not ready to put that out there yet. What we tested was an early version of that system, and I think it's something that I might put in a course in the future or teach a class on in some form. So I'm going to end the episode there. I know it's a bit of an abrupt ending. If you are interested in seeing something like that course in the future, please become a supporter of the show, and I will talk to you all later.